Hey guys, tonight we begin with life inside a Mongol ger camp on the open steppe, where the grass is endless, the wind has no manners, and your odds of survival depend entirely on how quickly you learn to stop being surprised by things. Then we move to the story of Torygin Khatun, the woman who held the entire Mongol Empire together through sheer force of will and a willingness to make powerful men deeply uncomfortable. After that, you'll find yourself working as a Mongol imperial administrator, travelling the conquered world with a census tablet and a job that sounds official right up until the moment it becomes life-threatening. And finally, we pull back the curtain on the internal chaos that the Empire worked very hard to hide, because it turns out that the most terrifying military force in human history was also, from the inside, a political disaster waiting to happen almost continuously. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in the camp just before dawn, which is not when you would have chosen to arrive, but the steppe does not consult your preferences. The sky is that particular shade of deep blue that exists for only about 20 minutes, before it becomes something else entirely, and in those 20 minutes the world feels both enormous and completely indifferent to the fact that you are standing in the middle of it without the faintest idea what you're supposed to do next. The grass extends in every direction with the blank confidence of something that has never once had to justify its existence. There are no landmarks you can use, no walls, no hills significant enough to navigate by, no tree line to orient against, just grass and sky, and the camp is the only reason you have any sense of where here actually is. Your boots are wet from the dew. You notice this now, standing at the edge of the camp before you have quite decided how to enter it, and the wetness works its way upward through the leather in the methodical way that cold and wet always do, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the patient inevitability of something that has identified a weakness and intends to exploit it fully. You've been travelling for a long time to get here. You've been hungry for most of that time and cold for a significant portion of it, and you have arrived at the one place that might offer relief from both of those conditions looking, you are fairly certain, like someone who should not be allowed near anything important. You take a breath. The air smells of grass and livestock and smoke, and underneath those things a wider smell that you cannot name precisely, but that your body recognises as open space, as the particular quality of air that has not passed through a city or a forest or any kind of obstruction for a very long distance. It is clean in a way that feels slightly aggressive, like it expects something from your lungs that your lungs are not accustomed to providing. The ger is already warm. That is the first surprise. You were expecting something cold and provisional, something that communicated impermanence and hardship in every direction. What you get instead is a round, solid, carefully constructed dwelling that is considerably better at trapping heat than the mud brick rooms you came from. The felt walls are thick, layered, and doing exactly what they were designed to do, which is to make the outside world someone else's problem. A small fire burns in the central hearth, its smoke rising in a careful column toward the circular opening at the top. Someone has been awake for hours already. You can tell because the fire has the settled confidence of something that was lit with intention, not desperation. This fire did not happen by accident. Someone built it carefully, tended it through the cold hours before dawn, kept it alive because the alternative to a living fire in a ger on the open steppe in early morning is a cold that you would prefer not to meet directly. You sit down, or rather you are gestured toward a place to sit, and you realise immediately that the seating arrangement is not casual. There is a structure here, a spatial logic that you're going to have to learn quickly if you want to avoid offending anyone. The right side of the ger, as you enter, belongs to the women. The left side belongs to the men. The far side, directly opposite the door, is for the most honoured guest or the head of the household. You have been placed somewhere in the middle of the left side, which tells you exactly where you stand in the estimation of the people whose home this is. You're not important, you're not unwelcome, you're simply being assessed, and the assessment has already begun. You try to sit the way everyone else is sitting, which turns out to be harder than it looks. The posture that is natural here, cross-legged and upright, without leaning on anything, without putting your feet toward the fire, without pointing the soles of your shoes toward anyone, requires a combination of flexibility and spatial awareness that your body, which has had no reason to develop these particular capacities, does not readily provide. You make adjustments. You make more adjustments. Someone glances at you briefly, not unkindly, and then looks away. You have not committed a serious offence. You have committed the minor, continuous offence of being someone who does not know the rules, which is its own kind of exhausting to maintain over the course of an entire morning. The woman tending the fire does not look at you while she works. This is not rudeness. You will learn that later. She's watching everything around her with the peripheral attention of someone who has spent their life in a space where awareness is not optional. Her movements are economical, each one doing exactly as much as necessary and nothing more. The ladle she uses, the vessel she keeps the fire to, the particular angle at which she tends the flame, all of it has the quality of things that have been done so many times they have lost the category of action and become something closer to breathing. She adds something to a clay pot, and the smell that rises from it is unfamiliar, rich, and slightly fermented in a way that your nose has not yet decided whether to classify as appealing or alarming. You decide to withhold judgment for the moment. Judgment requires a context for comparison that you do not currently have. That smell, as it turns out, is airag, fermented mare's milk. Your introduction to it arrives in a wooden bowl that is placed in your hands before you have had any opportunity to formulate an opinion on the matter. The bowl is smooth and dark with use, the kind of object that has been held by many hands over many years and carries the weight of that history in a way you can feel, even if you cannot quite name it. You look at the airag. It looks back at you with the quiet confidence of something that has been a staple food for centuries and has no particular interest in your reaction. You drink. It is sour, slightly fizzy, and cooler than the air around you in a way that feels impossible but is simply physics. You do not love it. You do not hate it. You understand, with the clarity of someone who has just run out of options, that this distinction does not matter. The relevant question is not whether you enjoy it. The relevant question is whether you're going to drink it without making an expression that communicates to everyone in the room that you're finding this more difficult than it should be. You manage this, barely. What matters is this: you're in the camp now. And the camp has its own rhythms, its own rules, its own logic, and none of it was explained to you in advance. You are going to learn it the way you learn anything in a place where asking too many questions marks you as a problem, which is to say slowly, imperfectly, through a series of small failures that you absorb and correct before they compound into something larger. The morning begins without announcement. One moment the camp is quiet, organised around the fire and the pot and the sound of wind moving across the outer veldt. The next moment it is not. Children appear from nowhere, moving with the confident chaos of people who have never once worried about being in the wrong place. Animals stir outside. The sounds of horses and cattle and sheep layer themselves into a low, constant hum that fills the air the way background noise fills a busy street, present everywhere and noticed almost nowhere. You hear a dog somewhere to your left, and then, farther away, another dog answering it. And then more dogs, each one working through a chain of call and response that carries across the camp and beyond it into the wider landscape, which turns out to be full of other camps that you could not see in the pre-dawn dark but can now hear, faintly, in the distance. You're not in one isolated settlement, you're in a network, and the network is waking up all at once. You are handed something solid. Bread is the closest word you have for it, though bread implies a softness and an intention toward your comfort that this object does not share. It is dry, dense, and grain-flavoured in the way that things are grain-flavoured when grain is the entirety of the ambition. You eat it anyway because the alternative is to sit there holding it while everyone around you eats theirs, and you're already doing enough things wrong without adding that to the list. Beside the bread, there is a small piece of dried meat that you eat without looking at it too carefully, which is the correct strategy. It tastes of smoke and salt and the particular flavour of something that was preserved for a very long time under conditions you would prefer not to think about. It is protein, it is calories, it is, by the standards of this morning on this steppe, exactly what you needed it to be. The men begin moving outside. You follow, because staying inside when the men are leaving feels like another mistake, and you're trying to conserve your mistakes for situations where they are unavoidable. The air outside hits you immediately. Cold, sharp, carrying the smell of animals and open land, and something that is probably smoke from other fires across the camp. You blink. The sky has finished its transition and is now pale gold along the eastern edge, which would be beautiful if you were not also aware that your toes are already complaining and that the complaints are going to get louder before they get quieter, and that there is nothing available at this moment with which to address them. The camp is larger than you expected from inside the ger. There are other gers arranged in a pattern that seems casual but is almost certainly not. The Mongols are famously deliberate about physical arrangement. The entrance of each ger faces south, away from the prevailing northern winds. The spacing between them allows movement without crowding. The animals are corralled in positions that make sense for both access and defense. You're looking at an organizational logic that has been refined over generations, and the only reason it does not look like a plan is because it has been practiced so many times that it has become instinct. Every family in this camp knows its place relative to every other family, without needing to consult anyone about it. There are no maps, there are no instructions, there is only the accumulated knowledge of how things are done, shared across generations through observation and repetition, until it becomes indistinguishable from nature. You're not part of this instinct. You are the person who is still figuring out which direction is south. The horses are the first thing that makes you feel genuinely inadequate. Every person in this camp, from the adults who move with the economical efficiency of long practice, to the children who appear to be riding before they have quite finished growing into their legs, relates to horses in a way that you simply do not. These are not horses in the way you think of horses. They are partners. They are tools. They are expressions of status, mobility, and survival all at once. A Mongol warrior could spend more of his life on horseback than on the ground. The horse was not transportation. The horse was the condition under which everything else was possible. On the open steppe, distance is measured not in how far you can walk, but in how far you can ride. And the difference between those two measurements is the difference between the life you know and the life of every person in this camp. A man on horseback can travel 6 times as far in a day as a man on foot. An army on horseback can appear in a place where no army was expected, and be somewhere else entirely before anyone has had time to organise a response. The Mongol military system was not simply a matter of bravery or discipline or tactical intelligence, though it required all of those things. It was built on the horse, on the relationship between a person and an animal, that began in childhood and deepened over decades into something that was genuinely difficult to train into someone who had not grown up with it. You're given a horse to manage. Manage is the word that someone uses when they hand you a lead rope and walk away. You stand there holding the lead rope, looking at the horse, which is looking at you with the particular expression of an animal that has already taken your measure and found it acceptable but not impressive. You tighten your grip on the rope. The horse shifts its weight slightly, just enough to remind you of the size differential between you, and then looks away, because having made its point, it has moved on in a way that you are still struggling to do. You decide not to take this personally. You have enough things to be discouraged about this morning without adding the attitude of a horse to the list. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the camp has settled into something you can at least observe if not fully participate in. The women are doing more work than you initially realised, which is to say, they are doing a great deal of work that the structure of the camp has rendered invisible. The gers themselves require constant attention. The felt must be checked, the ropes adjusted, the interior organised in ways that prevent small problems from becoming large ones when the temperature drops or the wind picks up or the camp needs to move. And the camp does move, not today, but soon. Everything about the way things are organised suggests temporariness, not in the sense of fragility, but in the sense of readiness. Nothing is attached to the ground more firmly than it needs to be. Everything that can be packed quickly. The lattice walls of the ger fold down, the roof poles come apart, the felt covering is rolled and tied. An entire dwelling can be collapsed and loaded onto a cart in less than an hour, by people who have done it enough times to stop noticing that they are doing it. This is not crisis behaviour. This is the ordinary tempo of a life that has never been organised around staying. You watch a woman loading panniers onto a pack animal with a methodical efficiency that borders on the hypnotic. Each item goes in a specific place, at a specific angle, balanced against the corresponding item on the other side. She does not look at what she's doing, not really. She looks at the horizon while her hands do the work, which means her hands know the work so thoroughly that her attention is free for other things. You have no equivalent skill, You have no task in which your hands operate independently of your conscious attention, no practice so thoroughly internalized that you could perform it while looking at something else. You feel this gap as a kind of smallness, a recognition that the competence of the people around you is built on a foundation of repetition that you have not had the years to accumulate. You begin to understand something about the nature of this civilization that did not fully land for you before you arrived. The Mongol Empire was built by people who did not think of permanence the way settled societies do. They did not build cities, not because they could not, but because cities were, from a certain angle, a disadvantage. A city ties you to a place. A city is a fixed point that can be surrounded, besieged, starved. A camp can move. An army that lives in camps can appear somewhere it was not expected, and be somewhere else before anyone has finished being surprised. The steppe was not a limitation, it was a strategy. The seasonal movement of the camp is not random, not a wandering without purpose. There are established patterns developed across generations for where the camp should be in spring, where in summer, where in autumn before the hardest cold arrives. The patterns are based on accumulated knowledge of where the grass is, where the water sources are, how the terrain and the elevation affect temperature across the different seasons, and how the movement of the animals through the landscape can be managed so that the grass recovers rather than being permanently depleted. This is a form of land management as sophisticated as anything practiced in settled agricultural communities, and it is performed without written documentation, without any fixed plan, through the knowledge held in the people who move with the camp and the animals. The carrying capacity of the steppe is not unlimited. Overgrazing a range means moving on and not returning for years, which means managing the overall territory as a resource that must be maintained rather than simply extracted. The Mongol approach to this was not always perfect, and there are historical periods where the combination of population growth and accumulated pressure on the land created genuine difficulties. But the basic principle, that the land was a resource to be managed rather than a resource to be used up, was built into the practice of the life in ways that did not require any formal statement to operate. It was simply what you did, because the alternative was starving. The people who lived this life for generations developed an understanding of the steppe ecosystem that was, in its own way, as detailed and specific as the knowledge of any settled farmer about their particular field. They knew which plants indicated good water below the surface. They knew which insects appeared before particular weather changes. They knew the behavioural patterns of the wild animals that shared the steppe with the herds, and they managed the relationships between the domestic animals and the wild ones with the practical knowledge of people who understood that the ecosystem as a whole was more productive than any single part of it managed in isolation. None of this appears in the historical record in any direct way, because the historical record was kept by settled people writing about nomads, and the categories available for thinking about pastoral life in the literate traditions of China and Persia and the Byzantine world did not have good language for describing the complexity of what was actually going on. What appears instead are accounts of people who moved around and did not build permanent things, which was interpreted as evidence of cultural simplicity rather than as evidence of a different and equally sophisticated adaptation to a particular set of environmental conditions. The misreading was consequential. It meant that the military shock of the Mongol conquest was, in the settled world's understanding, a visitation from outside of civilization rather than a collision between two different forms of organization, each of which had its own sophistication and its own advantages depending on the circumstances. The people who defeated the great sedentary civilizations of Eurasia in the 13th century were not doing something unprecedented by accident. They were doing something that their entire way of life had prepared them for, and had been preparing them for across generations of practice. Every child who grew up riding before walking, every adult who could break and load a camp before the dew had finished drying, every warrior who could sleep on horseback and wake alert, was the product of a civilization that had been optimizing for mobility across centuries. The cities they conquered were not just geographically fixed, they were cognitively fixed. They had stopped being able to imagine a threat that moved the way the Mongols moved, and that failure of imagination was, in the end, a large part of what made the conquest possible. The afternoon brings work that you are given without much explanation. Someone hands you a tool, you look at it, you look at the person who handed it to you. They make a gesture that means continue in the direction of this task, and then they walk away because they have other tasks and you are not their primary concern. You figure it out by watching, which is slower than being told and faster than guessing, and by the time you have a functional understanding of what you're doing, you have already done half of it wrong. You redo the half you did wrong. No one comments on this, which you realise after a moment is not indifference but practicality. Out here, fixing mistakes is just part of doing things. The important thing is that the mistake gets fixed, not that it gets discussed. The camp has no interest in your feelings about your performance. It has an interest in the task being completed, and as long as you are moving toward that completion, the journey there is your own business. The food in the afternoon is meat. This is not surprising. What is surprising is how little ceremony surrounds it. The Mongols were not historically a civilization that performed elaborate rituals around eating. They ate when food was available, ate efficiently, and moved on. The meat has been boiled simply, with water and the barest suggestion of seasoning, and it is served in a way that suggests the cook's priority was nourishment, not experience. You eat yours and feel grateful for it in a way that has nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with the fact that your body has been working since before dawn, and has been quietly filing complaints for the past several hours. The meat is real. The calories it contains are real. Your gratitude, which would have seemed completely disproportionate to anyone who had not spent the morning doing what you spent the morning doing, is real. These three things are sufficient. There is also more airug. You drink it with considerably less hesitation than you did this morning, which tells you something about the speed at which your standards adjust when the alternative is being thirsty. The sourness is still present, the fizziness still slightly startling, but your body has stopped registering these as objections and started registering them as simply what air is, which is to say a drink that is available, a drink that contains nutrients, and a drink that is, in the most practical possible sense, exactly what you have. You finish it and put the bowl down. No one is watching. The absence of observation on this small capitulation feels like a mercy. The evening is when things slow down enough for you to start noticing the social dynamics you were too busy surviving to observe during the day. There is a hierarchy in this camp, and it is not subtle once you know to look for it. The senior men occupy certain physical spaces without appearing to claim them. Decisions move in certain directions without needing to be argued. The camp leader, the man whose jur you are staying in, speaks less than you would expect from someone in his position. He does not need to speak often because the people around him already know what he would say. That kind of authority is not performed. It is simply present, the way gravity is present, requiring no announcement and generating no argument because everyone in its field has already accounted for it. There are also layers within the women's side of the hierarchy that you're only beginning to understand, and understanding them will require more time than you currently have. The senior wife of the camp leader occupies a status that is not subordinate in any simple sense. She manages the jur and the resources within it, makes decisions about the household's provisions, oversees the preparation and distribution of food, and does all of this with an authority that is recognized by everyone present. Her word on matters within her domain is not questioned. When she speaks to the younger women, the instruction is followed without debate, not out of fear but out of the understanding that she knows things they do not, that her experience carries weight, and that the smooth functioning of the household depends on deference in the right directions at the right times. You watch from your position, which is still firmly in the middle left of whatever this social arrangement is, and you try to absorb as much as you can without drawing attention to the fact that you are absorbing it. The firelight is warm. The conversations around it are low. Someone is doing something with a piece of leather, stitching it with the methodical patience of someone who has done this 10,000 times and expects to do it 10,000 more. The stitches are small and regular, and will last considerably longer than you expect them to. The person making them does not look at the work with any particular expression. They are simply present with it, which is itself a kind of skill that you're only beginning to recognize as such. To be fully present with a simple task, without boredom, without impatience, without the constant drift of attention towards something more interesting, is something that this life seems to produce in people, and that your life, with its many distractions and its many alternatives, has not produced in you. Outside, the wind has picked up, moving across the steppe with the long, low sound of something that has been travelling for a very long time, and has no particular intention of stopping. It finds the gaps in the felt walls and sends small cold currents through the interior, nothing devastating, but enough to remind you that the warmth in here is maintained by effort and construction, against an exterior world that is not interested in your comfort. You pull your outer layer tighter. Inside the gur, the fire responds to the draft by guttering briefly and then restabilizing, which it does without any assistance, because the hearth is built in a way that accounts for wind. You notice that no one else reacts to the draft. They have registered it as they register everything, and they have found it insufficient to merit a response. This is calibration, the careful understanding of what actually requires attention and what can be allowed to pass. You are still in the phase of finding everything slightly alarming, which means you are expending a great deal of energy on threats that are not threats, and missing, probably, some things that are. Learning which is. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Learning which is the primary survival skill in any new environment, and you are at the very beginning of that process. There is a moment in the late afternoon when the light changes in a way that makes the steppe look like something from a different kind of story. The angle of the sun drops below a certain point and the grass goes from pale and utilitarian to something warmer, something that catches the light along the individual stalks and turns the whole landscape into a kind of gold that you could not have anticipated from the morning. The gers glow slightly against it. The animals cast long shadows. Somewhere nearby, a child is singing something to itself in a language you do not understand. A small sound against a very large silence, and the combination of that sound and that light does something to your chest that you are not expecting, which is to make you feel, briefly and without adequate explanation, that you are in the right place. This feeling does not last long. It is replaced within a few minutes by the return of the cold, and the awareness that your legs are still complaining from the morning's work, and that you're going to need to figure out the sleeping arrangements before it gets dark. But the feeling happened, and that matters, not because feelings about landscapes are historically significant, but because it suggests something about how this life works on the people who live it. The steppe is not only difficult, it is also, at certain angles and in certain lights, genuinely beautiful, and the people who have lived in it for generations carry both of these things simultaneously. The hardship and the beauty, the cold and the gold, without needing to choose between them. The Mongols had a religious tradition that was not well understood by the foreign visitors who occasionally arrived to document it. Most of those visitors came from settled religious traditions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, each of which had texts and clergy and institutional structures that made them legible to each other in ways that the Mongol practice of Tengrism was not. Tengrism was not, in the conventional sense, a religion with a set of doctrines and a hierarchy of interpretation. It was a relationship between people and the forces that governed the world they inhabited, primarily the sky, which the Mongols understood as a divine presence called Tengri, and the earth, and the various spirits that inhabited the landscape and the animals and the events of daily life. A shaman, called a bu or udagan depending on gender, served as the intermediary between the human community and these forces, not by commanding them, which would have been presumptuous, but by negotiating with them, by understanding their moods and requirements, and by guiding the community through the spaces where human action intersected with something larger. The shaman in the camp is not someone you would have identified immediately. They are present in the ordinary life of the community in the way that everyone is present, doing tasks, participating in conversations, moving through the shared space of the day. The role becomes visible at specific moments, at births and deaths and major decisions, and the kind of extended bad luck that suggests something in the relationship between the community and the forces around it has gone wrong and needs attention. You notice someone in the camp who is treated with a particular quality of quiet respect, not the deference you have observed toward the camp leader, which is formal and social, but something slightly different, something that has more to do with being trusted with knowledge that other people do not have and would not know how to use if they did. The relationship between Mongol spiritual practice and the military success of the empire is not incidental. Genghis Khan himself consulted shamans regularly and understood his own rise as evidence of heavenly mandate, as the sky god Tengri's approval of his authority and his expansion. This was not mere political rhetoric, or rather it was political rhetoric that was also genuine belief, which is the most powerful kind. An army that believes it is fighting with divine sanction fights differently from one that does not. A ruler who understands his success as confirmation of cosmic approval does not suffer from the self-doubt that limits more cautious leaders. The theological framework of Tengrism, which did not make the categorical distinction between sacred and profane that most settled religious traditions insisted on, allowed the Mongols to engage with the world with a kind of confident pragmatism that was in many ways the spiritual expression of the same ability that made their military tactics possible. Heaven was not a destination, it was a presence, above and everywhere, and it approved of them, and that was sufficient. The fire in the evening is tended with the same care that was given to it this morning. The continuity of the fire is not an accident or a convenience, it has meaning. A fire that goes out is a household that has become cold in more than one sense, and the effort to maintain it through the night represents a commitment to the ongoing warmth, in every sense, of the community that lives around it. You notice this now, in a way you did not this morning, because you have spent a day in this place and your eyes are beginning to learn what to look for. The camp is not just a collection of jurs and animals and people. It is a set of practices, each one connecting to others, each one maintaining something that the next practice will build on. Take away any one of them, and the thing that the practice maintains begins to deteriorate. Keep them all, reliably, every day, and the whole system holds. This is civilization, not in the way the word is sometimes used, as a synonym for settled, for urban, for literate in the conventional sense, but in the original sense, the sense that preceded the cities, the sense of a community of people who have organized their shared life according to principles that allow them to survive and reproduce and transmit knowledge across generations. The Mongols were doing this on the steppe, as their ancestors had done it for thousands of years before them, in a form that was completely adapted to the environment they inhabited and completely effective on its own terms. The fact that it looked, to people from the outside, like chaos or primitivism, or the absence of civilization, was a failure of perception on the part of the observers, not a failure of organization on the part of the observed. It was the same failure of perception that led settled civilizations to consistently underestimate the military capacity of the people who lived in these camps, right up until the moment those people arrived at the city walls and began the process of demonstrating how badly they had been underestimated. The children are put to sleep in the warmest part of the gyr, closest to the fire, arranged in a way that distributes the shared body heat of several small people efficiently and without wasted space. They go to sleep without ceremony. One moment they are present, the next they are simply arranged horizontally with their eyes closed, which is either the result of genuine exhaustion or the trained pragmatism of people who have learned that sleep is a resource and should not be wasted on transitions. You suspect both. You pull your own sleeping materials into position such as they are and lie down. The mat is thin by the standards of what your body would describe as adequate, but it is between you and the ground, which means the ground is the ground's problem tonight rather than yours, and that distinction is worth something. The felt above you traps the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the people sleeping in the space, and the result is a temperature that is not comfortable in the way that comfort implies luxury, but is survivable in the way that matters most. You pull your outer layer tighter. The cold at night on the open steppe is not the same as the cold you're used to. It does not arrive gradually, does not give you time to adjust, does not offer the small comfort of predictability. It simply arrives, fully formed and comprehensive, covering everything simultaneously. Your nose, your fingers, the back of your neck where your collar sits slightly wrong. You try to minimize your surface area by pulling in, which helps in the way that very small things help when the problem is very large. The felt walls of the gyr do their work though. The interior remains navigably warm. You sit closer to the fire without being asked because the fire is warm and the fire does not care about hierarchy. Someone shifts slightly to make room for you. Not a gesture of friendship exactly, more an acknowledgement that warmth is a resource that should be distributed reasonably when the alternative is watching someone struggle unnecessarily. You nod your thanks, the person nods back. This is as far as the interaction goes, and it is enough. It is more than enough. It is, you realise with a slight surprise, one of the more genuinely communicative exchanges you have had since you arrived, and it involved no words at all. Later, much later, when the camp has settled into its night sounds and the fire has gone from active to maintained, a low steady ember glow that will persist until morning, because letting it go out is not worth the trouble of relighting it. You lie on the sleeping mat and try to understand where you are in relation to where you started. Not geographically, the other kind. You're inside a civilization that does not look like a civilization from the outside, or rather looks like something that will be over soon, temporary, nomadic, easily dismissed. But from the inside, what you see is an organization of people who know exactly what they are doing and have known for generations. The steppe is not empty. The steppe is full of people for whom this is home in the deepest possible sense, not despite its difficulty but in full acceptance of it. You are the one who arrived confused. They have been here, in various forms and in various camps across an enormous distance, for longer than most empires have existed. The civilizations that looked down on these camps as temporary, as primitive, as evidence of a people who had not yet learned how to build something permanent, were sometimes the same civilizations that those camps would come, in the 13th century, to entirely erase. The ground beneath the mat is harder than you would have chosen. Your body has opinions about this. You note the opinions and do not act on them because there is nothing to act on. The wind continues outside, indifferent and continuous. Someone nearby is already asleep, their breathing slow and regular, a sound that is oddly stabilizing in the dark. You focus on it for a moment, as an anchor, a piece of information your nervous system can use to establish that the situation is not, in fact, as alarming as the cold and the unfamiliarity have combined to make it feel. The breathing continues, in, out, steady. Whatever this person has navigated today, whatever the steppe extracted from them, they have arrived here and they are resting and their body is taking care of itself in the way that bodies do when the mind releases its grip. You close your eyes. The camp settles around you, and for a moment in the quiet between one breath and the next, you understand something that you could not have understood from any distance. This is not a place of chaos. This is a place of order so deep it does not need to announce itself. And somewhere in that understanding, your body finally decides that rest is permissible. It does not arrive all at once. It comes in the way things come on the steppe, gradually, steadily, from a very long way off, and then it is simply there. That quiet understanding, the sense that power does not always announce itself, that the most formidable systems are often the ones that look casual from the outside, connects naturally to the story of a woman who understood this principle more completely than almost anyone in the 13th century. She was not a general, she was not a conqueror, she was something considerably more dangerous than either. Teregin Khatun was born into a world that did not expect much from her, which was, as it turned out, a strategic miscalculation on the world's part. She was originally a member of the Merkit tribe, one of the groups that existed in complicated and often violent relationship with the early Mongol Confederation under Genghis Khan. The Merkits were not a minor people. They had their own history, their own territorial claims, their own political structures, and their own long memory of interactions with the Mongol clans that were not always friendly. The relationship between the Merkits and Genghis Khan was freighted with personal history as well as political conflict, because it had been Merkits who, years before Temujin became Genghis Khan, had abducted his wife Borte and held her for months before she was recovered. The enmity that grew from that period ran deep, and the eventual conquest of the Merkits was conducted with a thoroughness that reflected the personal quality of the grievance. Teregin survived that conquest. She was given as wife to Ogedei, the third son of Genghis Khan, the one who would eventually be chosen as Great Khan when his father died in 1227. She was, in the language of the time and the system, a spoil of war, a political arrangement, a woman whose function was to produce heirs and manage a household and remain largely invisible to the historical record. The men who arranged this exchange were thinking about territory and alliance and the management of a conquered population, not about the qualities of the specific person being handed from one household to another. She did produce heirs, she did manage a household. The remaining part of the expectation she declined. To understand how Teregin was able to do what she did, it helps to understand something about the position of women in Mongol society that tends to be lost in the broader narrative about conquest and violence. The Mongols, relative to most of the settled civilizations they interacted with and eventually conquered, gave women a degree of authority that was visible and real, not just ceremonial. The wives of powerful men managed the household's resources, which in the context of nomadic life meant managing a significant productive enterprise that included animals, goods, storage, movement, and the allocation of labor. These were not minor responsibilities dressed up in domestic language. They were the organisational core of the Mongol economic unit. Senior wives of the Great Khan, called khatuns, held formal positions at court. They had their own attendants, their own territories assigned for their support, their own administrative staff, their own seals with which to issue orders on matters within their domain. Foreign diplomats who visited the Mongol court regularly noted the prominent role of women in the court's social and political life, sometimes with admiration, and sometimes with the discomfort of people from cultures where women's authority was more carefully constrained. The Mongol court was not a place where women's power was hidden. It was a place where it operated in a different register from men's power, managing different domains, but where it was visible and acknowledged and within its domain genuinely sovereign. This meant that Torygin was not working against the system when she built her political influence. She was working within a system that already recognised that women could hold real power. What made her unusual was the scale at which she operated it, and the moment at which she chose to deploy it. Most khatuns wielded significant influence within the court's social and domestic sphere. Torygin used the influence she built in that sphere to shape the succession of the largest empire in the world. The system had not been designed to allow that exactly, but it had not been designed to prevent it either, and Torygin, who had spent years understanding exactly where the system's edges were, moved precisely in the space it had left open. She was also helped, in a certain sense, by the particular qualities of the crisis she faced. A contested succession is a moment when the normal rules of who holds power are suspended, when the question is actively open rather than settled, and when anyone who can claim the authority to manage the transition has an opportunity to exercise it. Torygin recognised this opening for exactly what it was. She moved into it not because she was reckless, but because she'd spent years preparing for a moment like it, and because she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the court, that the window would not be open for long. Once the Kurultai assembled, power would flow to whoever the assembly recognised. Her job was to shape what happened before and during the assembly, so that the outcome when it came was the one she needed. Ogedei was, by most historical accounts, a man of considerable charm and equally considerable weakness for wine. He was a capable ruler in some respects, continuing his father's campaigns with real success, expanding Mongol control westward into Russia and the Caspian regions, administering the empire through the systems his father had built. He commissioned the construction of Karakorum, the first fixed capital of the Mongol Empire, a city of such deliberate ambition that the mere existence of it represented a significant departure from the nomadic traditions that had made the Mongols what they were. He was in many ways trying to build something that outlasted conquest, something that looked and functioned like an empire rather than an extended campaign. But he was also prone to excess, prone to distraction, and prone to periods of instability that alarmed the people around him. The drinking was not a private matter. It was a public concern at the highest levels of imperial administration, and more than one advisor made carefully worded attempts to slow it down without generating the kind of direct confrontation that tended to end badly for the person doing the confronting. Torygin watched all of this. She watched and she learned, and she did not make the mistake of assuming that watching and learning were passive activities. She built relationships across the years of her marriage with the deliberateness of someone who understood that formal power was not the only kind available. She cultivated allies among the wives and mothers of other powerful Mongol figures, women who held significant influence in their own households and whose networks of information and loyalty extended throughout the court. She identified the people whose support was transferable and the people whose commitment was fixed elsewhere, and she kept careful track of both categories, understanding that knowledge of this kind was itself a form of power that could be maintained quietly and deployed at the right moment. She understood that in a system where formal power flowed through men, informal power flowed through the relationships between women, through the management of households that were also political units, through the access to information that came from being present in spaces where decisions were made and then discussed afterward over meals and evening gatherings, and the ordinary transactions of shared daily life. A woman in the Mongol court did not sit in the Kurultai. She did not command armies. But she knew what was said after the Kurultai, and she knew who had said it, and she knew which of those people would remember in 6 months that someone had been listening carefully while they spoke. When Ogedei died in 1241, the empire that Genghis Khan had built across an area roughly equivalent to the size of Africa did not have a clear successor. The system of Mongol succession, which required a Kurultai a great assembly of the leading figures of the empire to convene and formally elect a new great Khan, was theoretically orderly but practically complicated by geography alone. The leading figures were, at the time of Ogedei's death, scattered across an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Central Europe. Some were on campaign, some were in distant administrative postings, some were engaged in regional conflicts that did not automatically pause because the Great Khan had died. Assembling them took time, months potentially, and in that time someone had to run things. That someone was Toragine. She moved quickly. Before any formal arrangements could be made, before the various factions within the Mongol court had finished processing the shift in power and begun manoeuvring around it, Toragine had already positioned herself as regent. She did this not through violence, not through the kind of dramatic assertion that tends to generate resistance, but through the same patient intelligence she had been exercising for years. She made herself necessary. She made herself present. She made it clear to everyone who mattered that the alternative to her regency was not someone else's orderly regency, but rather chaos, and that chaos was not in anyone's interest, including the interest of the people who might have preferred someone else. The men of the court had to weigh their options carefully. Opposing Toragine directly meant advocating for some alternative, and any alternative would have its own supporters and its own enemies, and the process of determining who governed in the interim would itself become the kind of contested political battle that created winners and losers in a moment when the empire needed everyone's attention on the practical work of continuing to function. Toragine had read this situation correctly. The path of least immediate resistance was to let her govern, and then to use the time before the Kurultai to position whatever candidate you preferred. This was, from most perspectives, a reasonable calculation. What most of the men making it underestimated was how thoroughly Toragine intended to use the time she had been given. The regency lasted 5 years. From 1241 to 1246, Toragine Khatun governed the Mongol Empire, and she did not govern it timidly. She issued decrees under her own name and seal, which was not unprecedented for a regent but was uncommon enough to be noticed. She appointed officials, including, controversially, a woman named Fatima, who became one of her closest advisors and whose influence over the regent became itself a source of political tension and eventual tragedy. The appointment of Fatima was not casual. It was a deliberate decision to bring into her inner circle someone who was brilliant and loyal, and who lacked the independent power base that a male advisor would have brought, and with it the independent ambitions. Fatima served Toragine's purposes entirely, which was exactly the kind of relationship Toragine understood how to maintain. She replaced officials who had been loyal to Ogedei with people who were loyal to her, which is not unusual in transitions of power, but requires a particular kind of nerve to do at scale, and without the formal title of Great Khan behind you. Each replacement was a small assertion of authority that collectively built into something larger. By the time the Kurultai met to formally elect a successor, the administrative apparatus of the empire was staffed, at many of its key points, by people whose positions depended on Toragine's approval. This was not an accident. She navigated the various powerful men of the Mongol court, each of them with their own ambitions and their own candidates for the succession, without allowing any one of them to accumulate enough power to simply override her. This required constant attention and considerable diplomatic skill, because the men she was managing were not, in general, men who were accustomed to being managed by women, and the management therefore had to be conducted in ways that did not make the fact of it visible. You could not simply tell Batu Khan, the powerful leader of the Golden Horde, that his interests were being considered and balanced against others. You had to make him feel that his interests were primary, while simultaneously making the other powerful figures in the court feel the same thing about their own interests. Toragine did this for 5 years. That it required constant, exhausting attention is a reasonable assumption. That she managed it successfully is a matter of historical record. She also had a specific goal in mind for the succession, and she pursued it with the patience of someone who understood that short-term losses were worth accepting if they advanced the longer strategy. She wanted her son Guyuk to be elected Great Khan. Guyuk was not the obvious choice. He was not widely admired in the way that a successful candidate for an election of this kind typically needs to be. He was in poor health, prone to his own considerable drinking, short-tempered in ways that made him difficult to work with, and had a famously bad relationship with Batu Khan, the powerful leader of the Golden Horde in the Western Territories, whose support was considered essential for any Kurultai to produce a legitimate result. There was an incident during the joint campaign in Russia years earlier, in which Guyuk and Batu had come into open conflict over seniority and respect, and Guyuk had said things to Batu that Batu had not forgotten. Getting Guyuk elected would require managing not just the assembly, but the expectations and resistances of some of the most powerful military figures in the world. She managed it. The Kurultai of 1246, held near Karakorum, the Mongol capital, was a spectacle of deliberate ceremony. Toragin orchestrated. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Contemporary accounts describe an enormous gathering, thousands of attendees, tents stretching across the landscape in every direction, food and air in quantities that communicated imperial abundance and generosity. Foreign dignitaries came from across the known world, some of them having travelled for months to witness the formal installation of the new Great Khan. Papal envoys from Rome were present. Ambassadors from the courts of Russia and Central Asia and the Middle East sat in designated places and observed a ceremony that was designed, in every particular, to communicate that this was an empire at the height of its power and confidence, unified under a single legitimate ruler. It was theatre, and Toragin was its director. The audience did not know they were watching a performance. They thought they were watching a fact. Guyuk was elected. Toragin had achieved what she set out to achieve, against the resistance of men who were more powerful than her in every formal sense, and had been managed nevertheless into producing the outcome she required. What she got in return was complicated. Guyuk, now Great Khan, was not a grateful son in any simple sense. He moved quickly to consolidate his own power, which meant reducing the informal networks that his mother had built during the regency. Fatima, Toragin's advisor and confidant, was accused of witchcraft, a charge that was almost certainly a pretext, a politically convenient accusation designed to remove a person who represented Toragin's influence, while avoiding any direct challenge to Toragin herself. Fatima was executed. It was a message, delivered in the clearest possible way, that the regency was over and the rules had changed. A new centre of power had formed, and the old relationships that had operated around it needed to be severed. Toragin died in 1246, the same year as Guyuk's election. The historical record does not provide a clear cause. She was not young, and the years of the regency had been years of constant high-stakes pressure, of the kind that wears on the body in ways that do not always show until suddenly they do. What the record does suggest is that she died having accomplished the central objective of her political life, and having done so entirely on her own terms. The woman who arrived at the Mongol court as a captive from a conquered tribe left it having governed the largest empire in the world for 5 years and placed a great Khan on the throne. The history books have not always known what to do with Toragin Khatun. She does not fit the category of conqueror. She did not lead armies or direct campaigns, or appear in the kinds of battlefield narratives that tend to dominate the historical memory of this period. She does not fit the category of victim. She survived in one of the most dangerous political environments in the medieval world for decades, outmaneuvered people who underestimated her, and shaped the succession of the largest contiguous empire ever assembled. She fits the category of politician, of strategist, of someone who understood power at a molecular level and applied that understanding with patience and precision that was not available to most people in her situation. What is perhaps most striking about her story is what it reveals about the nature of Mongol society. The image of the Mongols that most people carry is an image of mounted warriors, of conquest and terror, of a civilization defined almost entirely by its military capacity. But the empire those warriors built required administration, required continuity, required the kind of patient institutional management that is invisible in the historical narrative of violence. Toragin Khatun was that management for 5 years at the highest possible level. The empire did not fall apart during her regency. It held together, continued its campaigns, maintained its communications, collected its taxes, managed its territories. And then she put someone on the throne, and the empire proceeded to fracture almost immediately thereafter, which is a fact that the historical record has not given her sufficient credit for having prevented as long as she did. The broader significance of Torogin's regency extends beyond the specific question of who succeeded Ogedei. It raises a question about the empire itself that the official Mongol narrative had very little interest in answering. The Mongol imperial project was, in its self-presentation, a project of masculine military achievement. It was built by Khans and their generals, conducted by armies, sustained by the tribute of conquered peoples and the fear of peoples not yet conquered. The official historiography of the empire, to the extent that the Mongols kept such a thing, centered on campaigns and battles and the will of heaven as expressed through the victories of great men. Women appeared in this narrative as wives, as mothers, occasionally as cautionary tales, and more rarely as figures of recognized importance. But the gaps in that narrative, the gaps between campaigns, between reigns, between the moment of conquest and the moment of stable administration, were often filled by women. Torygin was the most visible example, but she was not the only one. Sorkaktani Beki, the wife of Tolui and mother of Monkey, Kublai and Hulagu, three of the most significant rulers of the second generation of Mongol expansion, was described by foreign visitors to the court as one of the most capable and influential figures in the empire. She managed her husband's territories after his death, raised her sons with careful attention to the administrative and military education they would need, and positioned them for the succession battles that would follow Guyuk's brief reign. Marco Polo, writing decades later, would describe her as the most celebrated woman in the world, outside of only Mary, the mother of Christ, which was the best compliment a Venetian merchant of the 13th century knew how to give, and which, even accounting for its cultural bias, says something about the impression she left on people who encountered her legacy. The pattern that these women represent, the pattern of managing the spaces that official power could not directly reach, was not incidental to the Mongol Empire. It was structural, a nomadic confederation that moved across enormous distances, that had multiple centres of power spread across territories too large for any individual to oversee directly, that made decisions through an assembly process that was inherently time-consuming and conflict-prone, created spaces in which the people who understood the relationships between the powerful figures, who could read the social dynamics of the court and the requirements of the moment, were indispensable. Those people were often women, not because the Mongols had any ideology of gender equality that the historical evidence would support, but because the structure of their power created opportunities that the structure of most settled civilizations had been careful to close off. The Khatuns of the Mongol court held real authority in part because that authority was functional. The GR needed managing. The resources needed allocating. The children of the Great Khan needed educating in ways that would serve the empire's interests. Someone had to maintain the networks of obligation and loyalty that kept the court operating when the Great Khan was on campaign or drinking himself past the point of useful decision-making, which was not an uncommon circumstance in several reigns. The woman who did these things well accumulated the kind of knowledge that translates into power, the knowledge of who owed what to whom, of which relationships were fragile and which were durable, of what each person in the room actually wanted as opposed to what they said they wanted. Torygin spent years accumulating exactly this knowledge, and when the moment came when it was valuable, she used it with a precision that more overtly powerful people around her could not match. There is a lesson in this that is not specifically about gender, though it includes gender. It is about the kinds of knowledge and skill that formal power structures recognize and reward, and the kinds that they do not recognize but cannot function without. Every large institution, in every era, runs on both. The recognized kinds get the titles and the histories. The unrecognized kinds get the work done. Torygin Khatun belongs to both categories simultaneously, which is perhaps why the historical record has found her so difficult to file correctly. She was officially a regent, a temporary placeholder. She was actually one of the most consequential figures in the history of the empire, and the 5 years she governed were among the most stable and coherent of the entire imperial succession process, which is a fact that the succession processes before and after her tend to make vivid by contrast. Her story belongs to the same world you slept in last night, the world of the Jer and the steppe and the morning erag, and the social architecture that does not announce itself, and it connects directly to the world you're about to enter, a world of administration and record-keeping and the strange bureaucratic apparatus that the Mongols built on top of their military achievements, because even the most terrifying empire in history eventually has to count things. You arrive in the city carrying a tablet, a writing instrument, and the authority of the Great Khan, which sounds more protective than it turns out to be in practice. Your title is something that translates roughly as census official, though the role encompasses considerably more than counting people. You're an instrument of the imperial administration, the system that the Mongols constructed somewhat improbably to manage the territories they had conquered. The improbability is worth sitting with for a moment. The Mongols were not, in their origins, a bureaucratic people. They were a nomadic confederation that had spent centuries organised around kinship, mobility and military capacity. They did not have a tradition of written administration, of systematic taxation, of the kind of institutional record-keeping that allows empires to function over the long term. What they had was the sense to recognise these things when they saw them in the civilizations they conquered, and the pragmatism to adopt them wholesale rather than reinventing something inferior from scratch. The people who operated the Mongol administrative system were rarely Mongols. They were Persians, Chinese scholars, Uyghur scribes, Central Asian merchants who understood multiple languages and multiple accounting systems, people who had been absorbed from conquered territories and whose skills made them considerably more useful alive and working for the empire than they would have been in any of the alternatives the conquest had offered them. You are one of these people. You have skills that the empire needs and that the empire cannot easily replace, which gives you a kind of value that sits in interesting tension with the absolute authority of the Mongols above you. You are essential and you are expendable, sometimes in the same afternoon. You learned the administrative language of the Mongol court not because you were given a choice, but because the alternative to learning it was being significantly less useful, and being significantly less useful in a Mongol administrative context has consequences that tend to clarify priorities. You learned quickly. You're good at this work, not because you were trained to be, but because the work rewards careful attention to how numbers connect to things, how the counting of things connects to the management of them, and how the management of things connects to power, and you have always been interested in how power actually moves through a system, rather than how the system says it is supposed to move. The Mongols learned quickly that conquest was the easy part. Administering the conquered territory was considerably harder, and doing it badly meant losing the resources that conquest was supposed to produce in the first place. A burned city generates no taxes. A population that has been treated with sufficient brutality will spend all its productive energy on survival and resentment, rather than the kind of economic activity that fills imperial treasuries. The Mongols were not sentimental about this calculation. They made it, and they acted on it, and the result was a surprisingly sophisticated administrative apparatus that borrowed heavily from Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian models while being assembled and operated under Mongol direction. In China, the Mongols largely adopted the existing Tang and Song administrative systems because those systems worked, and because replacing something that works with something you are still building is an obviously bad idea. In Persia, they relied heavily on Persian administrators who understood local taxation and agricultural management in ways that no Mongol conqueror could have acquired in less than a generation. In Russia, the administrative arrangements were different again, more indirect, working through existing princes who collected taxes on behalf of the Mongol overlords rather than through direct imperial administration. The flexibility of this approach was itself a kind of administrative sophistication that is easy to miss if you are focused on the violence that made it possible. You are the person the system sends when it needs to know how many people live in a place, how many animals they have, what the land produces, and how much of that production can reasonably be taxed without collapsing the population's ability to produce anything the following year. This last calculation is the one that separates a useful census official from a destructive one. A tax assessment that extracts too much this year and produces nothing next year is a failure, not a success. The system needs to be sustainable. The empire needs to keep eating, and that means the people doing the work of production need to be kept alive and functional. Not an obvious insight, but one that requires constant enforcement against the short-term incentives of local administrators who might prefer to maximize extraction in the present without worrying about the future. This is not a glamorous assignment. It is, however, essential, and essential in a Mongol context means the consequences of failure are not abstractions. The city you're entering today is in what was once Persia. It has been under Mongol control for long enough that the raw shock of conquest has faded into something else, a resigned pragmatism on the part of the population, and a somewhat complicated administrative reality on the part of the empire. The Mongols who govern this region are not the same people who conquered it. They are in many cases the children or grandchildren of those people, and they have absorbed some of the culture and some of the administrative traditions of the territory they control, even as they maintain Mongol authority at the top. This creates a layering that you have to navigate every time you enter a new city, because the person you need to speak with about population records may be a Mongol official, or a Persian administrator working under Mongol authority, or some complicated combination of the two, and each of these people has a different relationship to the information you're asking for. The street through the gate opens onto a market that is functioning with the routine energy of a place that has made its peace with its circumstances. Merchants call out their goods, children run between stalls, a man with a cart of grain argues with someone about the price, in a way that suggests the argument has been ongoing for some time and has settled into the comfortable form of a dispute that neither party actually wants to resolve, because the arguing itself is a kind of relationship. You watch this for a moment. It is, by any reasonable measure, a sign of a city that is alive. Cities whose populations have not recovered from conquest do not argue about grain prices. They are quiet in the wrong way, or they are simply absent. The gate of the city is guarded. You present your paisa, the tablet that proves your authority, and the guard looks at it with an expression that is professional rather than welcoming. This is correct behavior on his part. He's not supposed to be welcoming. He is supposed to verify the tablet and let you through, which he does after a pause that is just long enough to communicate that he is doing his job deliberately and not reflexively. You note this and file it. People who are careful at gates tend to be careful about other things, and careful people are either very useful or very obstructive depending on which side of their caution you happen to be on. Inside the gates, the city is doing what cities do. Moving, trading, arguing quietly, constructing things, repairing things, producing the constant low-level noise of a place where human beings are trying to live in close proximity without losing their minds entirely. You have been in enough of these cities now to know that the noise is informative. A city that sounds like this, with its markets and its disputes and its general ambient activity, is a city that is functional, which means it is a city that the Empire can tax, which means your job here is administrative rather than investigative. It is when cities are quiet in the wrong way that the job becomes harder. You find the local administrator's office through a process of asking directions twice and being misdirected once, which is standard for any city where the person giving directions is not entirely sure whether being helpful to an imperial official is in their personal interest. There is always that calculation happening beneath the surface of ordinary civic helpfulness, the question of what this person wants and what the consequences of accurately providing it might be. You have learned not to take the misdirection personally. It is not hostility, it is caution. And in a city that has survived conquest by being careful, caution has a long institutional memory. The office itself is a room in a building that has clearly been repurposed from something else, possibly a merchant's counting house, judging by the dimensions and the placement of the windows, which are positioned to let in light at an angle suited for reading documents rather than for the domestic activities that most rooms in this neighbourhood were built around. There are documents on every surface and a man at a desk who does not look up when you enter, which is either a power move or genuine absorption in his work, and you cannot yet tell which. Both are possible, both are common. You introduce yourself, he introduces himself. You tell him why you are here. He nods in a way that suggests he was expecting this visit, which is reassuring, because it means the administrative communication ahead of your arrival has functioned as intended. He offers you tea, which you accept, and the meeting begins with the kind of deliberate pleasantness that both parties know is a prelude to a conversation that will become less pleasant. The records, he explains, are available, most of them. The census from 3 years prior is complete and organised. The tax records from the previous 2 collection periods are also complete, more or less, with some small discrepancies that he attributes to the difficulties of recording seasonal variations in livestock numbers with a consistent methodology. You note the words small discrepancies and the particular way he delivers them, with the professional confidence of someone who has prepared this phrasing in advance. There is a gap, he mentions with the careful vagueness of someone who has rehearsed this moment, in the records from the outer villages, specifically the villages in the Northern District which experienced some difficulties during the past harvest season. He uses the word difficulties. You note the word difficulties and the tone in which it is delivered, and the way his hands do not quite hold still while he says it. You will need to visit the Northern District. This is where the job stops being administrative and starts being the other thing it is, which is the work of a person who must ask questions in places where accurate answers create problems for the people who have them. The outer villages have their own relationship to the imperial census, and that relationship is not always cooperative. Not because the populations there are inclined toward defiance, necessarily, but because the census leads to taxation, and taxation in a recently conquered territory has a complicated emotional history that a tablet and a paisa do not entirely resolve. The people who live in these villages have been taxed before, by previous rulers under previous systems, and they understand that being counted is the first step in being taken from. Their resistance to accurate counting is not irrational. It is the reasonable response of people who have learned through experience what getting counted eventually costs. You hire a local guide, which is standard practice and also sensible because the Northern District is 3 days from the city, and the roads through that area are not roads in the sense of being particularly road-like. Your guide is a man of middle age whose expression communicates nothing in particular, which is itself a kind of communication. He speaks enough of the Mongol administrative language to function, and enough of the local language to be useful, which is exactly the profile of person who has spent a career surviving between two worlds without being fully claimed by either. He knows things you do not know about this territory, about the villages, about the people in them. He will share some of those things with you and not others, and you have learned not to push on the boundary between the two because pushing there tends to produce less information, not more. The road north is not terrible by the standards of roads you have travelled. It is unpaved, uneven, and enthusiastically dusty. But it is a road in the sense of being the direction that people have agreed to travel in, which is the fundamental definition. The countryside around it is agricultural, rolling, and currently in the early stage of recovery from a drought that the administrator had mentioned, in a way that made it clear the drought was at least partly responsible for the gap in the northern records. Crops that did not grow cannot be counted. People who starved cannot be taxed. These are facts that the imperial system accommodates in theory and struggles with in practice, because the system needs revenue continuously, and droughts do not schedule themselves to align with revenue needs. The first night on the road you sleep in a caravanserai that is cleaner than you expected and better supplied than the season would suggest. Someone is managing this establishment well, which means someone has found a way to maintain quality under difficult conditions, which means someone here has the kind of organisational competence that you recognise and appreciate because it is the same competence you're trying to exercise on a larger scale. You eat the food that is provided, which is simple and filling, and you think about the Northern District, about what you're likely to find there and how you're going to write it up in a way that is honest without being damaging. This is the particular ethical difficulty of census work in a conquered territory. The numbers you record will be used to set tax quotas. Those quotas will affect how many people in the villages you visit can afford to eat adequately next winter. If you record numbers that are too high, the quota will be too high, and people will suffer. If you record numbers that are too low, you will be lying to the Empire, which carries its own risks if the lie is discovered, and the Empire tends to be patient about discovering lies. You have to find the number that is accurate, which means the number that reflects what the territory actually is and actually produces, not what the local administrator wants you to see, and not what the village heads will tell you if you ask directly. You reach the first village on the evening of the second day. The village head meets you at the edge of the settlement with the wary politeness of someone who knows this visit was coming and has had several days to decide how to handle it. You've seen this particular expression many times. It means the person knows you have authority, knows that opposing you directly would be inadvisable, and has decided to cooperate in the most technical sense possible, while sharing as little genuinely useful information as they can manage. This is an entirely rational strategy from their perspective, and you respect it even while you work against it. You sit with him. You drink the tea that is offered, because refusing hospitality is a mistake you made once early in this career and have not made since. Refusing hospitality in a context like this signals distrust and creates exactly the closed, defensive atmosphere that makes your job harder. Accepting it signals a willingness to be present with people as people rather than as census subjects, and that slight shift in register occasionally produces candor that the formal interview process would never generate. You explain what you need, he explains what he has. The gap between these two things is where the actual work happens. The numbers he gives you for livestock are lower than the regional averages would suggest. This could mean the drought hit this area harder than the surrounding region, which is possible. It could mean animals were moved before your arrival, which is not unheard of and would be a sensible precaution for a village head who knew an imperial census official was coming. It could mean the numbers being given to you are accurate but calculated to minimize the taxable base, which is the most likely of the three options and the most difficult to demonstrate without more information than you currently have. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You visit the fields. You ask questions that are not directly about the numbers. You ask about the quality of the previous harvest, about what is being planted this season, about how the water sources fared during the drought. You ask how many households have children under the age of 5, which tells you something about the demographic recent history of the village without asking directly about population. You ask about marriages in the past 2 years, about deaths, about people who have moved away. These questions are not threatening, they are curious. And curiosity, you have learned, often generates more honest information than authority does, because people who are on guard against a demand will sometimes lower that guard for what seems like an innocent inquiry. By the end of the third day in the Northern District, you have visited 4 villages and spoken with 6 different people whose relationship to the truth of the numbers ranges from completely forthcoming, in the case of one woman who had clearly had enough of the whole situation and simply told you everything, to completely opaque in the case of a village head who had been practicing his version of events for so long that he appeared to have partially convinced himself it was accurate. You have a picture that is more accurate than what you started with, and less accurate than what the imperial records will eventually require it to be. This is normal. The census was never a perfect instrument. You write up your findings with the precision that the system requires and the judgment that the system relies on but does not formally acknowledge. You shade the numbers slightly toward the conservative side, not enough to be a serious misrepresentation, but enough to account for the genuine hardship of the drought season and the genuine uncertainty about recovery. You note the discrepancies you found and explain them as well as the available evidence permits. You describe the conditions in the Northern District honestly enough that whoever reads the report in Karakoram will understand that this is a territory in recovery, not a territory at full productive capacity. Whether this judgment is correct, whether your reading of the situation matches the reality on the ground in ways that actually serve the people who live there, is something you will never know for certain. The feedback loop in this work is slow and indirect. You write the report. The report informs the quota. The quota shapes what happens in the village next year. By the time any of those consequences become visible, you are in a different district entirely, writing a different report about different numbers. The Mongol tax system, as you have come to understand it across years of working within it, was a layered and sometimes contradictory apparatus that combined elements from every tradition it had encountered and absorbed. The yasak, or tribute, was the most basic form of extraction, a payment owed by conquered populations simply as an acknowledgement of Mongol authority. The kalan was a more systematic tax on productive activity, assessed based on the census numbers that people like you collected. There were also labour obligations, military service requirements for certain populations, trade duties collected at the numerous stations along the major routes, and various local arrangements that had been negotiated at the time of conquest and maintained out of a combination of practicality and the administrative difficulty of replacing them with something standard. The diversity of this system was both its strength and its weakness. It was flexible enough to accommodate the enormous variety of economic conditions across the empire, from the pastoral economy of the steppe to the sophisticated commercial economy of the Chinese coastal cities to the agricultural systems of Persia and Russia. But it was also complicated enough that the opportunities for local administrators to extract additional value for themselves, above and beyond what they were supposed to collect for the empire, were considerable. The principal tool for preventing this was exactly the kind of census work you do, the periodic official count that established a baseline against which actual collections could be compared. If the collections were significantly lower than the census suggested they should be, the discrepancy had to be explained. If it could not be explained, someone was in trouble. The trouble, when it came, was not always directed at the right person. The official who had been skimming was sometimes clever enough to have documented his collections accurately, while sharing the skimmed portion privately with the next official up the chain, creating a conspiracy of shared interest that the census comparison could not penetrate from the outside. You have seen this pattern. You have documented what you found and left the conclusions to others, because drawing conclusions about what specific people did with specific money is not your role. You count things. What the things mean is someone else's problem. There is something clarifying about this limitation. Your job has a defined scope and a defined method and a defined output. You arrive, you count, you report. The uncertainty lives entirely within those boundaries, in the gap between what you are told and what you can verify, in the judgment calls about which discrepancies are significant and which are within acceptable variance. Beyond those boundaries, the Empire manages itself as best it can, which is sometimes well and sometimes badly and almost always in a way that is more complicated than it looks from the outside. You return to the city on the afternoon of the fourth day. The administrator is in his office when you arrive, working through documents with the focused attention of someone who has found ways to make paperwork into something that does not feel like avoidance of other things. You present your findings. He reads them carefully, which is gratifying, because administrators who read carefully are administrators who understand that what you hand them is the basis for decisions, not just a formality. He asks 2 questions. You answer them. He nods. He says that the Northern District report will be forwarded to Karakoram with the quarterly administrative summary. This is standard procedure. The report will travel by yam, carried by riders across a distance that would take you months to cover on foot, and arrive in the capital in a matter of days. Someone there will read it. It will become part of an administrative record that covers not just this district, but the entire empire, a vast accumulation of numbers and observations and judgments made by officials like you in every corner of the Mongol world. From that accumulation, decisions are made about resource allocation, about military recruitment, about which regions need attention, and which are functioning adequately on their own. You collect your payment, which is in the form that administrative officials receive, a combination of goods and the currency that functions in this region, neither extravagant nor inadequate, simply the rate for the work done. You sleep in the city that night in a room that is considerably more comfortable than the caravanserai on the road north, and you lie there listening to the sounds of the city, which are different from the sounds of the camp on the steppe and different from the sounds of the villages in the northern district. Cities have their own nighttime voice, a low persistent hum of proximity, of many lives conducting themselves in adjacent spaces, of the city's metabolism continuing even when most of its inhabitants have stopped participating in it. You think about the woman in the village who told you everything, the one who had clearly had enough of strategic vagueness and simply wanted the business concluded. You think about the village head who had been performing his version of events so long he had half convinced himself. You think about the administrator in his repurposed counting house, careful and a little guarded, managing a situation that requires constant attention to things that can go wrong. These are not abstractions. They are people in a specific situation, doing their best within constraints that were not of their making. You are one of those people too. The Empire is, in a certain sense, all of those people simultaneously, and the thing that makes it function is not the Great Khan or the military force or the administrative apparatus, though all of those matter, but the countless individual judgments made by people in specific situations who are trying to get it right with the information they have. This is a generous way to think about it. You are aware that it is a generous way to think about it. The Empire has also produced enormous suffering. The conquests were brutal in ways that left cities empty, and populations reduced by proportions that still disturb the historical record centuries later. The administrative apparatus you serve is built on that suffering, even as it now works to prevent the further suffering that would come from extracting too much from people already living close to the edge. You hold both of these things, the efficiency and the violence, the pragmatism and the cruelty, the sophisticated administration and the brutal origin. They are not separate. They are the same thing at different moments in time. You close your eyes. The city hums around you. Outside, somewhere distant, the yam riders are moving, carrying their messages toward destinations that will shape decisions that will reach back eventually into places like the Northern District, into the lives of people who may never have seen a Mongol and who understand the empire only as the name attached to the authority that determines how much of what they grow they are allowed to keep. The system moves. It is always moving. And tomorrow you will receive your next assignment, and you will pick up your tablet, and you will go. When you ride back toward the city, the guide is quiet in the way that people who have been watching you work are sometimes quiet, as if they are deciding whether to say something. You have seen this quality of silence before, the silence of someone who has observed something they find slightly unexpected, and is considering whether the observation is worth sharing. He does not say something. You ride in silence that is not unfriendly, just honest. The road behind you is the same road you travelled 3 days ago, and the countryside around it has not changed. But what you are carrying now is different from what you arrived with, a set of numbers and an understanding of the gap between what they represent and what the territory actually is. The numbers are the thing you will hand to the administrator in the city. The understanding is the thing you will carry forward into the next assignment and the one after that, adding to a body of knowledge about how the empire works from the inside that no official document will ever fully capture. That gap, the space between official record and lived reality, between what the system sees and what people experience inside it, is the same gap that runs through the entire Mongol Empire, from the steppe camps where you slept in someone else's social order, to the courts where Torkin Khatun outmaneuvered people twice her formal rank. And it is the gap that opens widest when you look not at the empire from the outside, at the campaigns and the conquests and the staggering territorial extent, but from the inside at the courts and the successions and the political chaos that the empire's terrifying exterior was working very hard to conceal. Because from the outside, the Mongol Empire looked like a single thing. From the inside, it had been fracturing almost continuously from almost the beginning, and the story of that fracturing is considerably stranger, and more interesting than the story of how large it grew. The image that the Mongol Empire projected to the world was one of absolute unity under absolute authority. The Great Khan at the centre, his decrees carried by the Yam to the farthest corners of an empire that stretched from the Sea of Japan to the borders of Poland, his will implemented by governors and administrators and armies that moved with a coordination no other military force of the era could match. The message was clear. This is a single entity. This is a unified power. Do not mistake any apparent crack in the surface for actual weakness, because the surface is the reality. The surface was not the reality. To understand why, you have to understand something about how the Mongol leadership thought about the relationship between the Great Khan and the rest of the ruling family. Genghis Khan did not think of the empire as a state in the way that settled civilizations thought of states. He thought of it more as a family inheritance, a vast collection of territory and people and resources that belonged to the Mongol ruling house collectively, to be administered by the Great Khan with the support and participation of the other branches of the family. This model made sense in the context of the steppe tradition from which it emerged, where the leader of a confederation was primus inter pares rather than an absolute monarch, dependent on the loyalty and participation of the other tribal leaders to make anything actually happen. Applied to an empire the size of Eurasia, this model created a structural problem that became visible almost immediately after Genghis Khan died. If the empire belonged collectively to the ruling family, then each branch of the family had a legitimate claim on a portion of it. And if each branch had a legitimate claim, then the unity of the empire was always in tension with the legitimate interests of the people who were supposed to support it. The Great Khan needed the cooperation of the other branches to govern. The other branches needed the legitimacy of the Great Khan to maintain their own positions. But the interests of the centre and the interests of the regions were not always the same. And over time, that difference in interest became a difference in direction. Genghis Khan died in 1227 without having made the succession fully clear, which, for a man who had spent his life systematically eliminating sources of future conflict, was an oversight of considerable consequence. He had 4 sons by his primary wife, Borte, and the distribution of territory and authority among them was a subject of ongoing negotiation throughout the latter years of his life. The problem of succession was not simply who would be Great Khan, though that was the most visible part of it. The deeper problem was how an empire of this size would be administered over the long term, and whether it would remain unified at all, or whether the logic of regional administration would eventually produce regional independence. Jockey died before his father, which removed him from direct contention but did not remove his sons from the political landscape. Jochi's children, particularly Batu Khan, would go on to establish the Golden Horde in the Western Territories and spend the next several decades in a state of barely managed hostility toward the central Mongol court. The hostility was not random. It was rooted in a dispute that went back to Yoshi's parentage, because Jochi had been born not long after Borte was captured and held by enemies, and the question of whether he was truly Genghis Khan's son was never formally resolved, never spoken aloud in the court, never written into any official document, but also never entirely absent from the political calculations of the people who stood to benefit or lose from the answer. In a culture where bloodline determined everything, the ambiguity of Yoshi's bloodline was a wound that did not close because no one was willing to acknowledge it existed. It became instead a kind of permanent low-level infection in the political body of the Mongol ruling house, producing symptoms that recurred whenever the question of legitimacy became relevant. Ogedei was chosen as Great Khan by Kurultai in 1229, with the support of most of the principal figures of the empire. His reign was in many respects a success, extending the empire's reach and consolidating its administrative structures. He commissioned Karakorum as a fixed capital, which was itself a statement about the empire's ambitions. A nomadic people building a city is a nomadic people declaring that they intend to stay. It is also, from a certain angle, a nomadic people beginning to become something else, beginning the slow transformation from a military confederation into a territorial empire with the administrative apparatus and the fixed interests that come with that identity. But the manner of his death, following years of heavy drinking that had been publicly commented on for decades, and the chaos of the succession that followed him, revealed something important about the system Genghis Khan had built. It was extraordinarily effective at conquest and remarkably fragile when it came to the transfer of power. Each succession was an opportunity for the entire question of who was legitimate and who was not to be reopened. Each reopening created winners and losers, and each set of losers was a source of future instability that the winner had to manage on top of everything else. The Kurultai system was theoretically democratic within the Mongol ruling class, a collective decision by the assembled leaders of the empire's principal families and military divisions. In practice, it was a political negotiation of enormous complexity, shaped by prior alliances, personal ambitions, regional interests, the availability of military force to back up political positions, and the ever-present possibility of violence beneath the surface of formal deliberation. Each Kurultai was an opportunity for the various branches of Genghis Khan's descendants to advance their own claims, and each contested succession left behind losers who did not forget that they had lost. Guyuk's reign lasted less than 2 years before he died in 1248, likely from the same combination of chronic illness and the kind of sustained drinking that had characterized his father's decline. His death reignited the succession crisis immediately. Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, who had despised Guyuk personally and had refused to attend the Kurultai that elected him, citing his own health and the logistical difficulties of travelling from Russia to Central Asia, refused again to attend the next assembly. Without Batu, any election conducted would be missing the endorsement of the most powerful military figure in the western part of the empire. That was not a theoretical concern. Batu's armies were real and mobile and experienced, and the memory of what Mongol armies did to people who became their enemies was entirely fresh in everyone's mind, including the minds of the other Mongol nobles who would need to coexist with the Golden Horde after the election. The negotiations that preceded the next Kurultai were conducted over years, not months, a period of political manoeuvring that made the regency of Torogen look clean and decisive by comparison. The solution arrived at was the installation of Mongke Khan, from the Tolui branch of the family rather than the Ogedei line that had held the position since the beginning. This shift represented something genuinely significant. The principle of succession was being revised in real time, and the revision was accomplished not through any formal legal process, but through the application of political pressure, military threat, and careful alliance, building across an empire the size of a continent. The installation of Mongke did not happen cleanly. It involved a purge of the Ogedei and Chagatai factions that had opposed his election, carried out with the kind of efficiency that the Mongols applied to most problems they considered solved when the opposition was eliminated. Dozens of people connected to the previous regime were executed, their assets redistributed, their households dissolved. Others were demoted, relocated, or simply rendered irrelevant through the removal of the positions and resources that had given them standing. The reorganization was successful in establishing Mongol's authority, but it also deepened the fissures between the different branches of the family in ways that would not be healed. You could purge your opponents and install loyalists, but you could not purge the memory of the purge from the people who had witnessed it. Every family that lost someone in the consolidation of Mongol's power was a family that filed that loss away and waited. Mongol himself was a capable ruler by the standards of the period, serious and disciplined in ways that Guyuk had not been, genuinely attentive to the administrative challenges of governing such a geographically and culturally diverse empire. He commissioned surveys, reorganized taxation, attempted to standardize certain administrative practices across the different regions of the empire in ways that would reduce the variation in how things were done and increase the centre's ability to monitor what was happening at the periphery. He also extended the empire's military reach, directing campaigns against the Abbasid Caliphate in the west and continuing the conquest of southern China in the east. He died in 1259 during the China campaign, the cause disputed between accounts that suggest disease and accounts that suggest injuries sustained during the siege of a fortified city. The details matter less than the consequence. His death without a clear agreed-upon successor produced exactly the crisis that every previous succession had produced, except that this time the factions were more evenly matched, the regional interests were more firmly established, and the result was a civil war that the empire did not survive as a unified entity. Two of his brothers, Kublai and Arik-Bok, held rival Kurultais and declared themselves Great Khan simultaneously. The absurdity of this situation, two competing supreme rulers of the same empire being elected by overlapping assemblies in different locations within weeks of each other, was itself a measure of how far the institution of the Kurultai had drifted from its theoretical function. What followed was a civil war fought across the breadth of the empire between Kublai, based in China, and Arik-Bok, based in Mongolia, while the other major regional powers made their various calculations. The Golden Horde eventually supported Arik-Bok, partly out of opposition to Kublai, and partly because Arik-Bok represented the more traditionally Mongol position, the steppe-centered nomadic identity that Kublai was seen as having compromised through his deep engagement with Chinese culture and administration. The Ilkhanate in Persia, under Hulagu, supported Kublai. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was divided. Kublai eventually won, in 1264 when Arik-Bok surrendered and submitted himself to his brother's judgment. But the empire that emerged from this conflict was not the empire that Genghis Khan had built, or that the external world continued to imagine. The civil war had made visible something that had always been true but had previously been managed. The different khanates had developed distinct interests, distinct identities, and distinct political cultures that were not going to be subordinated to a central authority simply because the Great Khan instructed them to be. What remained, after 1264, was an arrangement of nominally related states that maintained a common vocabulary of Mongol identity and Genghisid legitimacy, while pursuing independent and often conflicting foreign policies. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Russia fought each other directly and through proxies for decades, primarily over the control of territories in the Caucasus. This was not a border dispute between distant states. This was a war between two branches of the same ruling family, conducted with the full military force available to each branch, producing casualties that numbered in the tens of thousands, devastating territories that both branches claimed as part of the same empire. The fiction of imperial unity did not survive the spectacle of Mongol armies fighting each other. The cultural absorption worked in both directions during this period. The Mongols shaped the societies they ruled, but those societies shaped the Mongols who governed them in ways that accelerated the divergence between the khanates. By the third and fourth generations of Mongol rule, the rulers of the various khanates were often indistinguishable in culture and practice from the peoples they governed. The Ilkhan rulers became increasingly Persian and Islamic in their orientation. The Yuan rulers in China became deeply embedded in Chinese administrative tradition. The Golden Horde rulers were shaped by their interactions with the steppe peoples and the Slavic populations of Russia in ways that differentiated them from their cousins in Mongolia. The shared Mongol identity was increasingly ceremonial, a way of legitimizing authority by reference to a common ancestor rather than a lived cultural reality that actually shaped daily governance. There were people inside the courts who understood all of this clearly, court historians and administrators with long institutional memories and senior advisors who had lived through multiple successions and seen the pattern, repeating with variations, each time understood that the empire was not what its official image said it was. The question of whether it could be held together was asked seriously by people who had real stakes in the answer. The attempts to hold it together, through strategic marriages between the branches, through formal agreements to resolve disputes through arbitration rather than warfare, through the maintenance of the yam and the shared administrative language, and the ceremonial deference to the title of Great Khan, were genuine attempts by people who believed that unity was preferable to fragmentation, and who understood that fragmentation would benefit primarily the populations they governed, who would be less afraid of divided regional powers than they had been of a unified world empire. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The attempts did not succeed in the end. But they succeeded enough, and for long enough, that the empire's fragmentation happened gradually rather than catastrophically, which is itself a kind of achievement that tends not to be credited to anyone in the historical record, because gradual fragmentation does not produce the kind of dramatic event that historians can point to as the moment everything changed. There was no moment. There was a long, slow loosening of connections that had never been as tight as they appeared, until eventually the looseness became the reality, and the connections existed only in ceremony. There is a period, roughly from the 1250s through the early decades of the 14th century, that historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The name is not entirely misleading. Within the territories controlled by the various khanates, the roads were safer than they had been before the conquests. The Yam provided a communication network of unprecedented efficiency. Trade moved across the continent in volumes and over distances that would not be seen again for centuries. Merchants who could travel from one end of Eurasia to the other, under a single political umbrella, more or less, without having to negotiate a dozen different custom systems, or pay tribute to a dozen different powers, took advantage of this in ways that accelerated the exchange of goods and ideas across an enormous distance. The Silk Road had always been a conduit for exchange. Under Mongol authority, it became something closer to a managed highway, with the relay stations of the Yam serving as infrastructure not just for official communications, but for the kind of commercial travel that brought silk from China to Persia and spices from the Indian Ocean trade into the markets of Central Asia and Russia. The terror that had cleared the road, the violence of the conquests, had paradoxically made a certain kind of peaceful movement possible in ways that earlier centuries could not have produced. Whether the benefits of that movement justified the cost at which the clearing had been accomplished is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. But the movement happened, and what it carried was not just silk and spices, but people, ideas, technologies and diseases, including, in the middle of the 14th century, the bubonic plague, which travelled the same routes that trade travelled and reached Europe from Central Asia, with consequences that reshaped the western half of the continent as thoroughly as the Mongol conquests had reshaped the eastern half. Inside the courts of the khanates, the cross-continental exchange was visible in every detail of daily life. Chinese silks hung in Persian throne rooms, Persian tile work appeared in Mongolian palaces, Chinese court painters travelled to the Ilkhanate and influenced the development of Persian miniature painting in ways that are still visible in the extant manuscripts of the period. Buddhist scholars from Central Asia worked in the Yuan court alongside Confucian scholars and Taoist practitioners and Nestorian Christian priests and Islamic imams, all of them coexisting in a space of remarkable religious diversity that was less the product of principled tolerance than of the Mongol pragmatic interest in useful knowledge from any source available. The Mongols did not care which god you served as long as you prayed for the health of the Great Khan and performed whatever function your expertise made you useful for. The scientific and scholarly exchange that accompanied this period produced results that are still visible in the history of knowledge. Persian astronomers working in the Ilkhanate compiled observations that would eventually reach European scholars and contribute to the development of the astronomical tradition that preceded Copernicus. Chinese advances in papermaking and printing technology spread westward along the trade routes, eventually reaching Europe in forms that would contribute to the conditions that made the printing press possible. Medical knowledge from multiple traditions found practitioners willing to learn from systems outside their own. The Mongol Empire was not an intentional engine of cultural exchange in the way that some later empires would define themselves, did not set out to diffuse knowledge as a policy goal, but it created the conditions under which exchange happened at an unprecedented scale as a byproduct of the movement of people and goods across a world that the conquests had, against all expectation, connected. All of this was happening simultaneously with the internal fragmentation. The Pax Mongolica and the political chaos were not separate phases of the empire's history. They were simultaneous conditions, operating at different scales and through different mechanisms. The roads were safe for merchants while the Khanate were fighting each other in the Caucasus. Trade was flourishing while the Kurultai system was producing contested elections. The administrative apparatus was functioning while the political legitimacy it rested on was being actively contested by competing branches of the ruling family. These things coexisted because they operated through different people in different places pursuing different objectives, and the fact that they were all nominally part of the same empire did not mean that they were actually coordinated with each other, or that the success of one implied the health of the others. In the Wan court, Kublai Khan built his palace at Khanbalik, which would later be called Beijing, at a scale that was intended to communicate the magnitude of his authority to every visitor who arrived there. The audience halls were enormous. The ceremonial was elaborate. The visual language of the court combined Mongol traditions with Chinese imperial practice in ways that were carefully calibrated to communicate power to multiple audiences simultaneously. Visitors from Europe, including representatives of the papacy and the merchant communities of the Italian city-states, arrived at this court and reported a sophistication and scale that seemed almost incredible to readers back in Europe. Their reports contributed to the European image of China and the East as a place of fantastic wealth and refinement, an image that would drive centuries of exploration and eventually produce the encounter with the Americas as an unintended consequence of looking for a sea route to the riches that Marco Polo had described. What those visitors were seeing, when they saw the UN court in its height, was something that was both genuine and constructed. The wealth was real. The scale was real. The administrative sophistication was real, but the unity was constructed, the authority carefully performed. The image of a great Khan who sat at the apex of a unified empire managing the diverse peoples of Eurasia was a projection, maintained by ceremony and protocol, while the reality underneath it was a collection of regional powers that shared a name and a dynasty, but were pursuing increasingly distinct trajectories. The Persian scholar and historian Rashid al-Din, who served as a court minister in the Ilkhanate in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, compiled a monumental history of the Mongol Empire that remains one of the primary sources for understanding this period. He was, in a certain sense, the ideal observer, a man of non-Mongol background who worked at the highest levels of a Mongol institution, fluent in the internal culture of the court and the languages of the scholarly tradition simultaneously. His history is remarkable not only for what it records, but for what it reveals about the gap between how the empire was supposed to work and how it actually did. He had access to oral histories, administrative records, and the accounts of people who had been present at events that the official chronicles sanitized. He used that access. What he produced was not the heroic narrative that the Mongol ruling house would have preferred, but something considerably more complex and considerably more honest. He was executed in 1318 during a political purge following the death of the Ilkhan he had served. This too tells you something about the nature of the empire. The most important historian of the Mongol world was killed by the Mongol institution he had dedicated his life to documenting. History has a complicated relationship with the people who tell it honestly. The story of Rashid al-Din is a specific version of a general problem that every conquering civilization eventually produces. When you build an empire large enough to require sophisticated administration, you eventually need sophisticated administrators. When you need sophisticated administrators, you eventually have to find people who are good at administration, which means people who are thoughtful and detail-oriented and capable of managing complexity. People who are thoughtful and detail-oriented and capable of managing complexity are also, as a general rule, capable of noticing when the system they are working within does not operate the way it claims to. The Mongol Empire needed Rashid al-Din more than Rashid al-Din needed the Mongol Empire, in the sense that the empire's historical record would be dramatically impoverished without what he compiled, while he would have been a court minister somewhere in any case. But the empire could not tolerate what that need required, an honest account of how it actually worked, and so it produced him and relied on his work and ultimately destroyed him. This is not an unusual trajectory for the relationship between power and the people who document it. but it is one of the cleaner examples on record. The question of religion inside the Mongol Empire is one that tends to get simplified in both directions. Some accounts emphasize the remarkable religious tolerance of the Mongols, which was real and which had practical roots. The Mongols had conquered populations that were Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist, Islamic, Nestorian Christian, Tibetan Buddhist, and followers of various Central Asian traditions. And the administrative costs of trying to regulate or suppress any of these traditions were not worth the political and social instability that such an attempt would produce. The pragmatic solution was to exempt religious institutions from taxation in most cases, to allow existing religious practice to continue and to maintain at the court itself a kind of studied neutrality in which representatives of multiple traditions were present and competing for imperial favour without any one of them being formally endorsed as the imperial religion. Genghis Khan himself maintained throughout his life the Tengrism of his steppe background, consulting shamans and interpreting events in terms of the will of the sky god, while simultaneously engaging respectfully with Buddhist lamas, Christian priests and Islamic scholars when they came to his court. This was not hypocritical in his own terms. He understood different traditions as representing different claims about the nature of the divine power that had chosen him for greatness, and he saw no reason to exclude any of them from the court's religious life when each of them offered prayers for his success. The Mongol conception of religious truth was not exclusive in the way that the Abrahamic traditions it encountered insisted it should be. Multiple things could be true simultaneously, and the sky god who had endorsed Mongol expansion could coexist with the Buddha and the Christ without any of them requiring the others to be false. This practical tolerance had limits, and those limits were instructive about how the tolerance actually worked. The Mongols were tolerant of religions that did not threaten their authority, and actively intolerant of any religious institution or leader that attempted to challenge the political power of the ruling house. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad had claimed universal Islamic sovereignty, which was a political claim as well as a religious one, and when Hulagu destroyed Baghdad in 1258, the execution of the last Abbasid Caliph was understood on both sides as a political act directed at a competing political institution. The fact that many Muslims around the world understood it as an attack on Islam itself was, from the Mongol perspective, a misreading of the situation. The Mongols had no quarrel with Islam. They had a quarrel with the Caliphate's political claims. The distinction, to the millions of Muslims who witnessed the destruction of their most sacred political institution, was not an easy one to accept. The aftermath of Baghdad's destruction illustrates another characteristic internal contradiction of the empire. Hulagu himself was not Muslim. His primary wife was Nestorian Christian, and his personal religious orientation, to the extent that it can be determined from the historical record, leaned toward the Buddhist traditions that had been influential in his upbringing. But the Ilkhanate that Hulagu founded and that his descendants governed became, over the following decades, progressively more Islamic in its cultural orientation, as the Mongol ruling class was absorbed by the Persian culture they had conquered. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhan Ghazan had formally converted to Islam and declared it the state religion of the Ilkhanate. The empire that had destroyed the caliphate had become an Islamic institution. The conquered religion had absorbed the conqueror, in the most literal possible sense, and what remained of the Mongol identity in Persia was ceremonial rather than substantive. This pattern, the absorption of the conquerors by the conquered culture over generations, repeated itself across the empire with variations depending on the local culture and the specific characteristics of the Mongol branch involved. In China, the Yuan Mongols became increasingly Sinicized in their administrative practice and their cultural orientation, while maintaining Mongol identity as a marker of ruling class status and resisting, through formal policies, the complete dissolution of the distinction between Mongol and Chinese. The resistance was not entirely successful. By the time the Yuan dynasty fell in 1368, replaced by the Chinese Ming dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China had been living in China for nearly a century, had been administering a Chinese empire using Chinese tools and Chinese traditions, and the specifically Mongol character of their rule was more ceremonial than substantive. They fell not primarily because of Mongol weakness, but because the peasant rebellions that undermined the dynasty were responding to conditions that had as much to do with the administrative failures of a Chinese-style bureaucracy as with anything specifically Mongol. The Golden Horde's trajectory was different again. The Western Khanate interacted primarily with the steppe peoples of the Pontic and Caspian grasslands, and with the Slavic principalities of Russia, a cultural environment very different from Persia or China. The Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde maintained a more recognisably steppe-based culture, for longer than their counterparts in Persia or China, partly because the environment they governed resembled more closely the environment they had come from. But even here the absorption happened, over a longer timescale and in different cultural directions, as the Golden Horde became increasingly Turkic in language and Islamic in religion, until the specifically Mongol character of the institution had faded into a Turco-Mongol identity that was its own distinct phenomenon, rather than a continuation of the original Mongol tradition. What this pattern of absorption suggests about the Mongol Empire is something that any honest assessment has to grapple with. The empire did not transform the world simply by conquering it. It transformed the world in part by being transformed by it. The exchange was not one-directional. The people who were conquered were changed by the Mongol presence, but the Mongols were also changed by the presence of the people they conquered, and the world that emerged from this mutual transformation was something that neither side had intended or could have predicted. The Mongol Empire was a catalyst, in the chemical sense, a presence that accelerated reactions between elements that would otherwise have interacted much more slowly, if at all. And catalysts are changed by the reactions they facilitate, even as they change everything around them. Inside the courts of all four Khanates, there were people who understood this process while it was happening and were troubled by it, who could see the specifically Mongol character of their institutions fading and who viewed this as a form of loss. There were also people who saw the transformation as an achievement, as evidence that the empire had succeeded in building something durable enough to survive the death of the original conquerors, something that had become a genuine civilization rather than remaining simply a military occupation. Both of these readings were, in their own terms, accurate. What had been lost was real. What had been built was also real. The question of which mattered more depended entirely on what you thought the empire had been for in the first place, and the Mongol Empire, as a general rule, had not been very interested in articulating what it was for. It had been interested in expanding, and then in administering what it had expanded into, and the question of ultimate purpose had been left, in the way of most large institutions, to be answered by the people who came after. The Mongol Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It dissolved Khanate by Khanate across a period of a century and a half, each piece becoming something new as the Mongol ruling class was absorbed by the cultures they had conquered, until the only thing remaining of the original empire was the memory of it, and the political geography it had created. The boundaries that the Mongol conquests established, the populations displaced, the trade routes opened or disrupted, the cities destroyed and rebuilt or not rebuilt at all, these shaped the world that came after in ways that persist today in the borders and populations and political relationships of Eurasia. That memory proved extraordinarily durable. Rulers in Central Asia would invoke Genghisid descent as a source of legitimacy for centuries after the last Mongol Khanate had ceased to function as a Mongol institution. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, who built his own massive empire in the late 14th century, could not claim Genghisid descent himself, so he married into the family and ruled nominally in the name of a Genghisid puppet. The name still carried weight long after the substance it had once described had disappeared. The strange thing about the Mongol Empire viewed from the inside is not how terrifying it was. That part is not strange at all. It is how human it was, underneath the terror. The succession crises and the court politics and the regional rivalries and the personal ambitions that drove individual actors were not anomalies in an otherwise unified system. They were the system, running parallel to the official image of absolute power, generating the actual decisions that shaped the empire's trajectory. The great Khan on his throne, the armies moving across the steppe, the relay riders carrying messages at impossible speed, all of that was real. But so was Torrigan Khatun managing a regency with limited formal authority and maximum effectiveness. So were the census officials navigating the gap between what they were asked to record and what they actually found. So were the village heads calculating exactly how much information to share with the man carrying the imperial tablet. So were the court historians writing accounts that told the truth in ways that powerful people might later decide they did not want told. The empire was enormous and it was fragile, and it was managed by people who were doing the same things that people inside every institution do, trying to maintain their position, advance their interests, protect what they valued, and survive the next transition. The difference was scale, and at that scale the consequences of getting it wrong were somewhat more significant than most. History tends to look at the Mongol Empire from the outside and see the conquest. That is the part that changed maps, the part that can be measured in miles and years and body counts. But the inside of the empire, the part that cannot easily be measured, the part that existed in the tension between official structure and actual behaviour, between the image of unified power and the reality of continuous fragmentation, that part is the part that explains what the empire actually was. Not a single unstoppable force, something considerably more interesting than that. A collection of people, operating inside a system that was larger and older and more demanding than any of them, trying to figure out what they owed it and what they could take from it and how long they could make it last. It is the same question that gets asked inside every institution that has ever existed. The Mongols just asked it at a higher volume and with more horses, and the fact that we are still asking the same questions, still navigating the same gap between official image and lived reality, still finding that the most consequential people in any system are often not the ones the system officially recognizes, suggests that the Mongol century is not as distant from the present one as the centuries between them might imply. The forms change, the structures change, the scale and the stakes and the specific cast of characters change, the gap does not. And on that note, gently, unhurriedly, it is time to let the Mongol world settle back into the distance. You have spent this evening in 4 very different places, and the distance between them is worth acknowledging before we let all of it go. You woke before dawn on the steppe, in a camp where order did not announce itself and the hierarchy was visible only to people who already understood it. The ger was warm, the erag was unexpected, the horse was unimpressed. You spent a day observing people who knew exactly what they were doing in a world that looked, from the outside, like it had not been organised at all, and discovering that the organisation was there in every detail, so thoroughly practised it had become invisible. You learned something about the relationship between competence and performance. The most competent people in any environment tend to look the least like they are working. They have internalised the work so completely that it has become simply the way they move through the day. You followed Toragin Khatun through one of the most demanding political careers in the medieval world, watching her build influence in the spaces the formal system had left available to her, and use it to shape the succession of an empire that most people alive at the time understood as the single most powerful political entity on Earth. She was given a role and she used it as a launching point for something larger, which is what every remarkable person does in a system that was not built to accommodate them. She did not ask for permission to exercise the authority she accumulated it in ways that made asking for permission unnecessary. And then she used it, once, at the moment of maximum consequence, and then she died having done what she set out to do. The historical record does not give her the credit she deserves. The historical record rarely does, for people who work in the spaces between the official structures, but the evidence is there for anyone who looks at it carefully. The empire held together during her regency and began to come apart almost immediately after. You travelled the roads of the conquered world as a census official, carrying a tablet and a piezer and the uncomfortable awareness that the numbers you recorded were going to shape real lives in ways you could not fully predict or control. You sat with village heads who gave you the numbers they thought you should have rather than the numbers that were true, not because they were dishonest people, but because honesty was not, in their experience, a reliable strategy for survival under a system that would tax them based on what you wrote down. You asked sideways questions and watched for indirect evidence, and made judgment calls that you knew were imperfect, and then you wrote the best report you could and moved on because that is what the work required. The census official is one of those roles that history tends to ignore entirely, because it does not produce the kind of dramatic event that gets recorded. It produces the sustained ordinary function of an administrative system, which is less interesting to read about and far more important in actual practice. And you looked behind the image of absolute Mongol power at the fractures that the image was designed to conceal, the succession crises and the regional rivalries, and the slow dissolution of a unified structure into its component parts. You watched the Kurultai system fail, repeatedly, to produce clean transitions. You watched the Khanats diverge in culture and identity, until the common name was the only thing that connected them. You watch the Pax Mongolica happen simultaneously with the political chaos, trade flowing across routes that politics was actively contesting, the system's benefits and its dysfunction operating in parallel, each real, neither one cancelling the other out. What connects these four places is not just geography or time, it is the gap between how things appear and how they actually are, between the official story and the lived experience, between the image of unity and the reality of competing interests, between the authority that a title conveys and the actual work required to exercise it. This gap exists in every institution that has ever been built, in every organisation, in every court, in every family, in every structure that human beings have assembled to manage the fact of living together in a world that does not automatically cooperate with their intentions. The Mongol Empire made this gap particularly visible because the stakes were so high and the contrast between the exterior image and the interior reality was so dramatic. An empire that looked like one thing from the outside was several different things from the inside, each of them genuine, each of them incomplete, each of them dependent on the judgment and energy of people who were not the Great Khan, and whose names do not appear in the official chronicles, but without whom the chronicles would have had nothing to record. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The Mongols built something genuinely extraordinary. The scale of organisation they achieved, the speed of their communication, the sophistication they developed for administering territories that were culturally and geographically utterly unlike each other, these are achievements that deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than simply as backdrop to the violence that made them possible. The violence was real, and it was enormous, and it should not be minimised. But the empire that followed the violence was also real, and it produced conditions in which things happened that would not have happened otherwise, things that we live with the consequences of today in ways that are not always obvious. The connection between the Mongol Empire and the world you're living in right now is longer and more complicated than most people imagine. The political geography of Central Asia, the distribution of populations across the Eurasian steppe, the development of the overland trade routes and then the gradual shift toward maritime trade, as the land routes became less safe in the post-Mongol period, the spread of certain diseases across populations that had not previously been exposed to them, the dissemination of technologies from east to west and west to east that contributed to the conditions of the early modern period. All of these things have roots in the Mongol century. The world that exists now is not the world that would have existed if the Mongol conquest had not happened. What that alternate world would have looked like is not a question that can be answered, but the question itself is a reminder that history is not inevitable, that the world is shaped by specific people making specific decisions under specific circumstances, and that what those decisions produce can be quite different from what anyone intended. This is the thing that history keeps teaching and that keeps being forgotten, and that we keep coming back to learn again. No one who was alive in 1250 was trying to produce the 14th century. No one who was alive in the 14th century was trying to produce the 15th. The world emerges from the collision of intentions and circumstances and chance in ways that no one plans and no one controls, and the empires that look most controlled from the outside are often the ones that are most surprised by where they end up. History is full of systems that looked, from the outside, like they had solved these problems. The Mongol Empire is a reminder that the solution is always temporary, that the inside of any institution, no matter how powerful it appears from the outside, is always more complicated, more contested, and more dependent on the judgment of individual people than the official image suggests. It is also a reminder that impressive things can be built by people who are also deeply, thoroughly flawed in their governance, their succession planning, and their capacity to imagine a future beyond the immediate moment. The pyramids were not built by enlightened rulers. The cathedrals were not built by saints. The yam was not built by a system that had figured out how to transfer power peacefully. These things were built by people doing their best with what they had and what they understood, and some of what they built lasted far longer than the circumstances that produced it. You have travelled a long way tonight, not in miles, but in the kind of distance that actually matters, the distance between what things appear to be and what they are. And now the steppe is quiet, the ger is warm, the fire has settled to its steady ember glow, Outside, the wind moves across the grass with the sound of something that has been travelling for a very long time and has no particular place it needs to be. There is no caravan to catch. There is no message to deliver. There is no report due at the administrator's office in the morning. There is no Kurultai to manage or succession to engineer. There is only this, the warmth and the dark and the sound of the wind against the felt walls and the slow, steady breathing of people who have worked a long day and given themselves over to rest. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the faces you met tonight, the woman tending the fire with her patient efficiency, Torrigan reading the room of a Kurultai she had spent 5 years engineering, the census official on a dusty road calculating the gap between the numbers given and the numbers true, Rashid al-Din writing a history that would outlast everyone who tried to control it. Let all of them recede into the comfortable distance of history, which is to say the comfortable distance of other people's choices in other people's times. They made their choices. They lived inside the consequences. The empire they inhabited has been gone for centuries, and what remains is only the trace of it, the borders and the trade routes and the genetic lineages and the ideas that travelled with the merchants and the scholars and the relay riders across a world that was briefly, strangely, improbably connected. You are part of a different world, one that is connected in different ways through different systems with different images and different gaps between the image and the reality underneath. But the pattern is familiar, and recognising the pattern in someone else's history, in someone else's century, is one of the ways that the past becomes useful to the present, not as instruction, exactly, but as company. A reminder that other people have navigated impossible systems before and found ways to be human inside them. Let that thought settle gently. Let it become something quiet and unhurried, the way the steppe is quiet after the camp has settled, and the fire has found its rhythm, and the wind has accepted that no one is going anywhere until morning. You have your own time, you are in it right now, and right now it asks nothing of you except this: rest. Let the night do what nights are for. Let the day that is coming arrange itself without your help for just a few more hours. The steppe will still be there, the history will still be there, the questions will still be there, patient and unhurried, the way good questions always are. They will wait for you. Questions always do. For now, there is only the warmth and the dark and the sound of the wind and the easy, uncomplicated fact of being still. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.